Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, body positivity, and health at every size. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified intuitive eating counselor specializing in weight-inclusive wellness. Join me as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beef, and now I'm ready for the world. Try and sink my teeth in, stacking extra cheese.
Hey there, welcome to episode 94 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Levinovitz, who is an assistant professor of religious studies at James Madison University and a journalist who focuses on the intersection of religion, science, and culture. He wrote the book, The Gluten Lie and Other Myths About What You Eat, and I wanted to talk to him today because, well, a couple of things. It's actually the beginning of Lent, and I know a lot of people have food rules and taboos and things that they give up for Lent that can really trigger disordered eating. So I thought this was a good time to talk about the intersections of food and religion and how dieting really has become a religion in modern society. That's his thesis of his book and of a lot of his writing. And he does such a great job of explaining all of these connections that I never would have even thought of between religion and dieting. I will just give a trigger warning for his book because there is some content in it that could be triggering, but it's a great read nonetheless. So if you're not struggling with an active eating disorder or disordered eating, it's totally worth checking out for professionals in this field. And his writing in various publications, I think, is awesome too. He's written for The Atlantic, Wired, Slate. So I will put a link to his stuff in the show notes, of course, for this episode, but just wanted to give that trigger warning for the book since it might be, depending on where you're at in your journey, not quite the right time to read it yet. But this conversation does not have any trigger warnings because we really had such a great talk about diet culture and religion, and I can't wait to share it with you all in just a moment. First, though, I want to tell you about a couple of great resources for helping you make peace with food. The first is my free quiz to assess if you have a healthy relationship with food, kind of see where you're at. And I'll send you your results via email, along with more than a dozen individualized tips to help you make peace with food wherever you may fall on the spectrum right now. You can take the quiz and get your results today at christyharrison.com/quiz. That's christyharrison.com/quiz. The second resource I want to share is my intuitive eating online course. It's a 13-week program that I created to help you work through all the principles of intuitive eating in depth and really demystify and troubleshoot some of the common areas where people tend to get stuck with intuitive eating. So I'll show you how to recognize the diet mentality even in its subtle forms and how to start substituting healthy thoughts instead. I'll share my secrets to making food and exercise choices from a place of self-care rather than a place of self-control. I'll teach you how to navigate emotional eating and how to stop alternating between restricting and overeating, and how to do all of this from a health at every size, body positive, weight neutral perspective. So the course really is designed to help you make peace with not only food, but also your body, learn to accept your body and trust its wisdom to guide you, whatever size you may be, just help you give up the pursuit of weight loss in favor of having a really good relationship with food. And check out what a few of the participants have had to say about this course. I'm so grateful for both the Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course as well as the Food Psych podcast. The course helped give me a community to stay on track towards a shared goal, which is so, so important. This course was extremely well designed and well written. I love the infographics as well as the links to pertinent Food Psych episodes. I also reinforced things that I'm already working on in therapy and in life more broadly. I wouldn't change a thing about the course. That's from participant with initials MM. And then participant JS says, this course has been so helpful. I've learned so much about how the diet mentality and the food police in my head have led me to restrict foods. I've learned about self-compassion and treating myself kindly, and the resources have been so valuable. The Q&A podcasts in which participants can ask questions and get answers from Christy are incredibly helpful. I no longer feel alone in this journey towards peace with food. So if you'd like to join other people on this intuitive eating journey, go to christyharrison.com/course to learn more and sign up. That's christyharrison.com/course. And finally, I have some exciting news that I wanted to share with you because you're a part of making this happen. In the past week, we just broke 1 million downloads of the podcast. And that is so exciting. I was telling my fiance, I was like, I don't think I've ever had 1 million of anything in my life. And he was like, well, probably like breaths or heartbeats or, stuff like that. And I was like, oh my God, yeah, like 1 million of anything is pretty special and pretty essential, right? Like I haven't had 1 million of anything except for the very essential stuff. And doing this podcast actually does feel very essential to me because I love doing this and I love sharing the body positive message with you all. And I love that you're downloading it and listening. And it means so much to me to be reaching people. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for all these downloads and for all your amazing support over the years with this podcast. And if you want to help us reach more people and continue to share the body positive message and hopefully reach 1 million more people, head over to iTunes from your computer or go to your podcast app on your phone, type in Food Psych to the search bar, click on the result that comes up under podcasts, and then click on the ratings and reviews tab. And you can leave us a nice rating and review there, which will help other people find this podcast and bring us up higher in the search. And also you can share episodes with your friends and family. That's a really great way to help spread the word about the podcast as well and help us reach more people. So now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Alan Levinovitz. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
I had a great relationship with food growing up. My parents were outstanding chefs. They loved food. They loved to cook. I ate a wide variety of foods, and I never really thought about food as health or wellness. I always thought of it as kind of an aesthetic experience, like art. And I came to think that it was sort of a point of pride that I ate a wide variety of foods, and that was a point of pride for my parents as well. And it was only when I got out of the house and went to college that I really started to encounter people, in their own natural food environments and realized that there were actually a lot of different ways of approaching food, and that mine and my family's was in the definite minority, both in terms of what we ate and how we thought of it as a part of our lives.
Yeah. So the sort of foodie environment, it sounds like, that you were in was very different.
Yes, absolutely.
Were they professional chefs or?
They weren't, but they were really, really good home chefs. They were members of something they called the Gourmet Group, where all these different couples would get together and, they would practice dishes for this on me. So they'd be like, all right, we're going to make, this fancy dish, and we're going to try these different preparations of it. And so they encouraged me to learn how to cook as well. So it was really a foodie environment. And also, I think in retrospect, I'm very grateful to them. I think it was a healthy, in the holistic sense, right? Both physically and mentally, it was a healthy relationship to food. I wasn't scared of food, that it would hurt me or that it would be bad for me. And it fit into my life, not just as, fuel or medicine, but also as something to enjoy as a part of, my own unique culture.
That is so rare in this day and age, and so powerful to have a relationship with food that's based around pleasure and not fear.
Yeah, again, in retrospect, especially after writing my book, I'm incredibly grateful for that, and I hope to be able to give that to my daughter as she's growing up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting aspect of things, having a daughter, right? Because I'm sure, as a man growing up in our society, maybe some of those diet culture influences didn't come in as early with like teen magazines or that sort of thing. I know
No.
It's happening now, unfortunately, more and more to young men, but I wonder if you ever experienced that when you were growing up.
No, I never did. In terms of self-consciousness, when I was growing up, my body was not really, or my weight at least, was not really my focus. I was always, I was a little I had I got hair on my face and my chest before other people. And I guess as a guy, I was more conscious of that than anything else. And it was actually only later in life as an adult where that really became more apparent to me. And I think, I think you're absolutely right that this is becoming more a part of men's lives as well. Rather than reducing the superficiality of what is messaged to women, I think a part of gender equality has been dishing out equal amounts of body insecurity to both genders. Kind of a sad direction to go in.
I totally agree. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Men are now being marketed to just as aggressively as women.
Right.
Yeah. But it sounds like you were really protected from that.
I was. And like I said, I was lucky, but also, it was a handicap, especially when much later in life, when I started working on food. It was a handicap in the sense that I didn't really understand what people were going through. So my initial attitude was maybe a little bit more clinical and a little bit less empathetic. And if I could go back and do it differently, I would bring in more of what I understand now about what people are going through.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I think that is, it's hard to grasp how people might not relate to food in a sort of easy way if you haven't gone through that.
Right, absolutely. And there's an illusion, or at least there was for me, and I've been like this in all aspects of my life, which is that, well, if you just show people the evidence and you crank the logic gear, they'll pop out the other end happier, right? It's like, oh, here are these people. They don't realize they could just have this wonderful relationship with food. I'll just sort of like, smash their face into the evidence and force them into an argument. And 2 days later, they're like, oh, thanks, Alan. That's great. Now I'm eating all this food and I feel terrific about it. Of course, as you and I'm sure your listeners know, that's just ridiculous and it's inconsiderate as well. And so I'm sort of retrospectively apologizing for that side of me. I mean, I think it's part of my character, but I should do more to tamp that down and think about who's on the other end.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I definitely have that side to my character as well, like the very logical, sort of argument driven side that's just like, well, no, just hit him over the head with it, many times. And I think that from a young age, I was like this. My family often joked that I should become a lawyer because I would just get an argument and just not let it go. And I still do this in my personal life to some extent. And it's like, not the greatest quality sometimes, but I think for writing an article that's debunking nutrition myths or something like that, it can be very useful. But I think I've had to work pretty hard too in my nutrition counseling career to kind of empathize and bring people along instead of just being like, well, no, you just have to eat this and you'll be fine. Like,
right. Well, and it's funny. I mean, you say nutrition myth, right? And I'm sure we'll get into this, but in comparing people's attitudes towards food to religion, I should have known. Here I am, a religion professor, but I didn't think about this. That when you say debunking a myth, for the person who's a believer, it's deeply insulting. You're not just calling it a myth is basically saying to them, you're invested in a falsehood. You've been deceived. You're mistaken. And when it comes to something like religiosity, whether it's your understanding of your own religion or whether it's your dietary habits, it's like walking into someone's church and telling them that their symbols are wrong and bad. And so that debunking attitude, which I think is really common and which I have, really needs to be tempered with an understanding that to the person whose beliefs are being debunked, it's not a myth yet at all. It's a truth. And that's a tough line to walk, and it requires a lot of skills that I don't have, quite frankly, and that I'm in the process of developing that I need to be conscious of not having.
That's really powerful to be aware of that, at least to sort of understand that there is that other side. Because I think the people who gravitate towards those nutrition myth, debunking stories might already be questioning.
Right.
Like it's sort of, if you capture the right people in the right moment, I guess, and they're ready to change or they're thinking that something isn't working for them, I think then maybe that kind of logic could be of service. But when people are just in it, and I went through my own eating disorder too, so I know personally like how doggedly I was holding on to it and how I just wouldn't sort of entertain any other perspectives. I was like, no, it's definitely gluten. So I had my own, we can talk more about this, but like in my eating disorder was around 2003, 2004, early days of the gluten-free craze, like very early days. And I kind of sunk my teeth into that world and was like, oh, gluten is the cause of all these health problems that I'm having that no doctors have really been able to explain, that PS were due to restricting my food and overexercising. But I was looking for some other answer that didn't involve eating more food and exercising less. And so it was like, oh, yeah, gluten clearly is the answer. And when people challenged me on that, I just would not hear it. And I was really dogmatic about the gluten belief. So I for sure get it. And I know that probably some people listening are maybe in that place right now. So it's like, just, I don't know, it was such a process, I guess, to chip away at those beliefs and really recognize it wasn't working for me.
Right. It's interesting, right there, you use that word dogmatic, right? Which, again, it's a reference to religion. We've got dogma. And I think it's easy to believe that, it's also easy to think when you're writing something, when you're debunking something or trying to explain something, it's easy to believe that the person on the other end is just reading what you've written, But of course, as I realized, when you get into these worlds, these diet and nutrition worlds, not just gluten, but anything really, you're surrounded by websites filled with generally beautiful people extolling the virtues of whatever diet they're on, and it's just unbelievably powerful. And so when you are in the middle of that and you read one article that's pushing against it, it's nothing. It's like shouting into the wind. And I experienced the power of those websites in that world myself firsthand. I'm a guy who was never really that conscious about this sort of thing. And I started compulsively weighing myself. I'm looking at these guys who are, 50 years old and chiseled bodies. And I was like, oh my gosh, do I need to look like that? These are things that have never really crossed my mind before. And all of a sudden I found myself, I don't know, behaving in ways and thinking in ways that I never had. And that was as a person who was literally in these sites to debunk them. And it still had power over me. And that was a very intense realization.
That's amazing. So you were already writing about this world and looking at it through the lens of religion and then felt yourself pulled in.
Absolutely.
Wow. So yeah, let's go back a little bit to kind of how you got interested in religious studies to begin with and what that journey looked like.
Yeah. So I, even going back as far as high school, I was really interested in bioethics. And when I got to college, I started studying bioethics, and I realized that really what I was interested in were the ways in which we decided what was ethical and what wasn't. And that encompassed not just ethics or philosophy, but also religion. And I was fascinated by the way in which religion had all these different persuasive techniques that philosophy didn't, right? So you could tell a story, you could tell a parable, you could have a first-person confession, right? Call it. People talk about witnessing your own personal experiences. So there's all these different persuasive techniques that also include logic and evidence that are available in religion, and I became fascinated by those. So I ended up getting a PhD in religion and literature, which is basically just the intersection of different genres, whether it's, parables or prophecies or myths or whatever, and religion. And that was what I studied. I specialized in classical Chinese thought. So I wrote my dissertation on this obscure, not obscure, actually, very pretty famous obscure, I think, to most people, but to me, pretty famous classical Taoist text called the Zhuangzi. And that was what I was studying. And I never really expected that an interest in religion and literature with a focus on ancient Chinese thought would ever end up in science and dietary, writing a book called The Gluten Lie. But, here I am talking to you. So
yeah, it really led you down this path you never saw coming. How did you get interested in food as religion?
Well, I wrote an article for Slate. I was in China a while back between my undergraduate years and graduate school. And this was a time when people were scared of MSG. And it's some people may still be. Some of your listeners may have reactions or perceived reactions to MSG, but for the generation before me, there were no MSG signs everywhere. Just like there's gluten-free now, it was no MSG. It was all over the place. And a lot of the people who were in China needed me, because I spoke Chinese, to tell our servers not to put MSG in the food. And so I would do this and they would comply. And then one time I'm talking to a server and I'm doing the same thing. And he says, we can't do that. It's already in all of the food. And I said, well, I've been asking all the servers at all the other restaurants to not put it in. He says, they're just telling you they're not putting it in. That's really? And he says, yeah. And he looks at the table and the people are eating some dish that was on the table, like peanuts and cilantro or something. He says, there's MSG in that. And I said, I was sort of shocked. And I did a horrible thing where at a couple of restaurants, I told them that I told these people, it was bad. In retrospect, a horrible human being. It was not ethically cool at all. But I told them that they had taken the MSG out and they hadn't, and there were no reactions. And I sort of forgot about this. I just filed it away. And then many years later, I was like, I wonder if the gluten thing is like the MSG thing that I experienced in China so long ago. And I started looking into the studies, and I wrote this article for Slate in which I suggested that maybe some of the reactions to gluten, not all, but some, might be due to suggestion, to what's called the nocebo effect, which is basically the opposite of the placebo effect. So if you're told something is going to make you feel better, it will sometimes. And if you're told something is going to make you feel bad, it will sometimes. And so I suggested that. That article took off, and I realized that there were actually lots of connections between diet. I couldn't even believe it. All of a sudden, I thought to myself, well, people talk about food in religious ways. It's not just, maybe the explanation here is that the power of religion exists in the secular world in the area of diets. And so I started thinking about this more. And I noticed everyone talks about, sinfully delicious, guilty pleasures. There's something called, I think, Halo Top ice cream, which literally
God, yeah.
Literally has a halo on it. There's all this moral language associated with being good. I was good, so I can do this. And all of a sudden, it was clear as day. This is what people are doing. And I thought to connect it to religion is really easy because people have always been obsessed with purity. There's dietary laws in every religion, and they are meant to separate in groups from out groups. They're meant to keep you physically and mentally and spiritually healthy. Often people fast in religions as a way, as a means of spiritual cleansing. To the body is dirty, but the mind is clean. And so because food is associated with the body, if we eliminate food, then we become closer to God. And even most interestingly to me, and I start the book off with this anecdote, there were Taoist monks 2,000 years ago who were telling people not to eat the so-called wu gu, which are the 5 grains. And if you didn't eat the wu gu, you would be able to fly. You would be able to teleport, which is different from flying. I didn't realize that. So you fly to see the sites, but you teleport if you just want to get there really fast. And you could fly, you could teleport, you could clear up your skin. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, they cared about their skin 2,000 years ago. This was a shtick that they had for restrictive diets.
Wow.
And so it sort of blew my mind. I said, you know what, I gotta write a book about this. I have to write a book about the way in which modern dietary practices conceal what are at base kind of quasi-religious rituals under the language of science.
Mm. Yeah, it really is fascinating how closely aligned they are. And I wonder, as I've read your book and have read articles about it and stuff, I keep wondering if the fact that religion is not a bigger force in modern life has anything to do with the rise of sort of religiosity around food, like gluten, or being gluten-free, or orthorexia, which is a new sort of emerging eating disorder that seems to be much more prevalent now than ever before. And I don't know, it's struck me that, I don't know if there's any sort of connection between maybe the diminishing power of the church or religion in people's lives and people putting more emphasis on food and diet as a way to achieve purity or moral superiority or something.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm not an expert on sociology of religion, so I can't speak to the numbers, but there's no question that with my students, for example, there's the so-called rise of the nuns, and nun, not the religious nun, but the opposite, None, which is people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious. And they're searching for, one of the things that drops out when you're spiritual and not religious is rituals and communities. And one of the things I started to realize is that any kind of restrictive diet, and when I say restrictive, I don't mean amount of food. I also mean to include, you don't eat this, but you do eat that, creates a community. And all of a sudden you're a vegetarian, or you are a paleo eater. And that's really important. It creates solidarity. It means you share a very important ritual, eating, right? We have to do this ritual every day. It's an incredibly personal ritual. You take something from outside of your body and put it into yourself. And I think that as religious eating rituals disappear and as religion itself recedes as a source of authority on what we ought to do for our health, it seems to me a logical step to think that dietary practices are helping to fill that in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, I feel like sometimes I have seen clients, for example, with eating disorders in the Orthodox community, and that's a community in which eating disorders are pretty prevalent. It's thought to be because of the fasting rituals there and the fact that fasting sort of can set off the environment pulling the trigger in the brain of someone who is already predisposed to anorexia. So, there's those sorts of connections too, where religion can sometimes, or religious dietary practices can spark disordered eating as well, and not be sort of a tempering force, but actually kind of drive people further in a direction.
Right. So one of the things I've learned, as I was talking about earlier, is whereas before I just would have said these things without thinking about it and happily hoped that people who are listening right now would think to themselves, oh, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I guess I'll stop doing that. Terrific. I realize that there are probably a lot of people listening right now who are thinking to themselves, I'm vegetarian or vegan because I think that's good for the environment. Or why are you criticizing that? And I want to make it very clear. I think there's all kinds of good reasons to not eat certain kinds of foods, whether you feel that that's best for the environment or whether you're concerned with animal rights or whether you're concerned with your own health. So I want to make it very clear that this is by no means a blanket condemnation of the myriad dietary practices that people engage in that are very important to them. Rather, all I really want to do is give people a different way of thinking about why they might be doing what they're doing. So to flip this example, because Lent is coming up, we're recording this. I don't know when people will be listening to it. We're recording this right before Lent, right? And I think a lot of people see Lent as this opportunity to diet. And religiously, that's just not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be this time to connect with God. And I think that it's not diets in themselves. I mean, you know much more about this than I do, but I don't want to say that diets or restricting your food is in itself dangerous. What I do think is dangerous is when people don't realize why they're doing what they're doing, or they don't realize why they feel the way they feel. And it's very easy to deceive yourself about what you're doing and convince yourself that what you're doing for Lent is a religious practice when in fact you're just trying to lose weight. Or it's easy to convince yourself that you are engaging in, I don't know, you're trying to help the environment, but what you're really trying to do is something else entirely. And so that's, I think that it is important for people to be open to the idea that what they believe about what they're eating and its effect on their own body, or what they believe about why they're eating what they're eating, might not be true, and that the disconnect between the two could potentially be harmful.
I think that's a really great point because, like you said before, with the images of beautiful people being used to sell something, or the idea, because it's so pervasive in our culture now, right, that people should lose weight, or that there's a healthy weight and an unhealthy weight, or that we're supposed to look like, this unattainable ideal, quote unquote, that's put forth in magazines and billboards. And all of that is just like the soup that we swim in. So you can't really disconnect that completely from people's motivations, right? Like even people who go into, say, vegetarianism or veganism from a place of wanting to reduce harm to animals and the environment sometimes get sort of pulled along into this other way of thinking just because that's what's all around us. That's what people in the community might be sort of espousing as well. And so suddenly it's not just about what you thought it was, but it's this whole other thing of like wanting to be pure or wanting to be accepted or loved or valued because you have a certain type of body. And that's what you've been told leads to being accepted and valued and loved.
Right. Yes, exactly. And that gets reinforced in these communities as well. You show up to the annual paleo meeting and people are like, you look terrific. And it's this incredible endorphin rush. It's only momentary, right? And in the end, I think it's very counterproductive. But just being aware of the way in which these practices have been around for a long time, have always held out impossible hopes and made impossible promises. I think just being aware of that can make people a little less intense. And for those people who are seeking to dial down the intensity of their relationship with food, the amount of time that they spend thinking about it, I think that kind of knowledge and that kind of awareness can be extremely helpful.
Absolutely. I think knowing that people used to believe not eating grains could make you fly and teleport is pretty helpful at sort of bringing some levity into it, right?
Oh yeah, and it made you resistant to disease. I mean, these are we have ever and always wanted to be good and beautiful and to be distanced from death. And we're just so incredibly susceptible to people who make those promises to us, and I see it again and again and again. And it's not stupid people falling for this stuff. It's everyone, because these desires are so powerful. And so it's important. It really is important for people to realize that and step back from the intensity of their relationship to food to sort of take a kind of meta perspective on it and be like, okay, what am I doing? Is this really going to work? What do I expect to get out of this? Does this seem like the kind of miracle promises that in another context I would laugh away? Or do I feel like my expectations are reasonable?
Right. That's such a great point. And I loved your sort of explication of that in the book about how to tell if someone is promising a miracle cure, or what are the hallmarks of somebody selling you snake oil versus somebody who's actually steeped in traditional medicine and science and has some sort of authority backing their claims.
Yeah, and the sad thing is when you are in, and this is like when you're in a bad place, when you are profoundly dissatisfied with how you look, when you are in pain that doctors have not been able to resolve, the last thing you want is someone saying to you, well, you can try this, but I'm not sure it's going to work. What you're looking for is someone who says, don't worry, I got you. Here's what everyone else doesn't want you to know. And here's what I know, and it's going to work for you. That kind of charismatic hope is what people have always looked for from religion, right? That's the prosperity gospel. If you have faith in God, you can get out of the hole that you're in. God wants you to be wealthy, and God wants you to be beautiful, and God wants you to have teeth that are as white as mine, because all these prosperity gospel people have incredibly white teeth. I think that when those kinds of promises are made, they're both an indicator that you shouldn't trust the person, and they're also exactly what you want to hear.
Yeah. It's a really tricky thing, right? It's hard to distance yourself from it when you're hearing exactly what you want to hear at a moment of vulnerability.
That's it. You said it. That's exactly right.
I think it's really interesting, this concept of pain and sort of having an unexplained diagnosis or something like that, or unexplained, say, gastrointestinal pain or whatever, that you could easily pin on food. And you talk about how people sort of come to that with gluten, but actually that, like, you make such a great point that anxiety about food and what you're eating can actually cause many of the same symptoms, which I think is so important to know. And yet I remember someone somewhere along the way telling me, like, oh, maybe it's just stress, or maybe you're actually too stressed out about what you're eating, when I was in my eating disorder. And I was just like, oh, please, just stress, so yeah. It wasn't helpful in the moment. But looking back, I'm like, oh, clearly I was just so anxious about what I was eating and doing it in such a disordered way that the result was dry skin and fatigue and foggy mind and all of these sort of nebulous things that often get pinned on gluten.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned foggy mind. So one of the things, two things in there I want to talk about, because I think they're both really important. First of all, the mind is so crazy powerful. Again, if we take this to religion, right? There are people who, for a long time, people just believed in demons. They believed in demonic possession. And because of that, people got possessed. Demons would come in. They would speak in these crazy satanic voices. This kind of thing happens all the time. And we can look at that and we can say, oh, that's clearly a case of people believing something and then having that belief cause the thing that they believe is going to happen. But then when we take that out of the sphere of things that we don't believe, and we put it in the sphere of food, or something like that, all of a sudden it's much harder to see that that might also be what's going on, even though, as I talk about in the book, we have examples of this, of, mass epidemics that are caused entirely by false information about food poisoning in a community or something like that. And then the second thing I wanted to touch on is the way in which we're very willing to accept that the mind can have positive effects. So people love the idea that you can heal yourself with your mind. Everyone's into the placebo effect, oh, it's
Totally.
great. But as soon as you say to them, well, the reverse is also true, maybe that's what's going on. No way. What are you saying? And that's because we want to believe that we are forces for good, that our minds are forces for good. We want to believe that we can help ourselves. But the last thing we want to believe is that we could harm ourselves. It makes us feel like we're the cause of our own suffering. It makes you feel like you're blaming the victim, right? And that's both something to be very careful about when you're talking to people about the nocebo effect, but also something to be aware of, right? If your mind has the power to make you feel good, your mind also has the power to make you feel bad. And that's why I get so angry in the book and in articles I've written. I get so angry at these diet gurus who blast people with terrifying information, that gluten or salt or sugar or whatever is going to give you Alzheimer's or cause cancer, because they are essentially speaking demons into being. And that's a horrible thing to do. Why would you want to summon up demons that don't exist? I can't imagine anything more irresponsible.
It really is. And I think the only answer that I've been able to sort of come up with is money, right? It's maybe fame, fortune, acceptance, whatever, but also it makes a ton of money. You can sell a lot of products by telling people, hey, this thing is killing you and I have the alternative, and buy my book to find out how, or buy this cookbook to find out how to remove the dietary demon from your diet, right?
Right, exactly. And also, though, I really loathe, there's one person who I'm sure many of your clients and listeners are familiar with, this guy, David Perlmutter, who wrote the book Grain Brain. And I started researching this guy, and I was shocked by what I found. People can do the research for themselves, because that's not really the point. But he'd been into all sorts of crazy schemes, and he was charging people through the nose for these oxygen tanks and so on. And at first I thought it just must be for the money. But I think that actually physicians, and I've talked with many who treat intractable diseases, gastroenterologists, are constantly running into patients who they can't help. When you can't help someone, you want to be able to give them something. You want to be able to tell them what's wrong, and you want to be able to tell them what to do in order to fix it. And so a generous interpretation, I think, is that sometimes the doctors or the dietitians are equally desperate. They are as desperate as their patients. The pain of not being able to help someone's pain or know what their pain is also really bad. And so I think that pushes you into a position where you start to want to believe in demons, because if there aren't demons, then it's just a mystery. And from studying religion, I know that there is people say nature abhors the vacuum. Well, the mind abhors mysteries. We always want to be able to explain things, especially suffering. And so I think that a part of what's going on is that demons, dietary demons or actual demons, are just what we need to believe in to make sense of a world in which inexplicable pain is everywhere and unresolvable.
Oh, that's such a great point. And I think I've definitely been more generous in other episodes too about that, because I think there are many health practitioners out there who want to help people and are looking for answers. And maybe they've been taught like, oh, this is what you need to cut out of someone's diet to help them feel better or whatever. So they're not necessarily doing it from a place of malice. But I think some of the really egregious ones, it's like, it's about the money and maybe the fame, like narcissism or something. But I think for a lot of more typical providers, it is probably coming from a place of trying to help.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I'm doing penance right now. So I've done a lot of attacking. So I'm trying to be a little bit nicer. But yeah, when push comes to shove, there's no question that money and fame and fortune are a part of it.
Yeah. And I think that's just something else that people can sort of be aware of and take into account, right? Like, what is this person trying to sell me? Follow the money, right? Like, what's the benefit to someone for telling me that they have the answer and that everything I knew about medicine is wrong.
Right.
It's like, well, that benefits them.
Yeah. No, there's going to be people, I know there's people listening right now who are thinking, well, mainstream medicine is making oodles of money off of all of their drugs and surgeries and all that stuff. And what I would say to people is that's true. But that doesn't mean that everything is false and we can just turn to anyone who insults mainstream medicine and accept it, right? The countercultural, anti-elitist move, again, right? Those Taoist monks who said, don't eat the 5 grains, that's because they were countercultural. The mainstream consensus was you eat the 5 grains, right? That's what everyone eats. And so there's a way in which anti-elitism and making people feel special and like they're different from the mainstream is really compelling. So we need to be careful to be able to criticize flaws in the system without throwing the system out entirely and uncritically embracing whatever it is that attacks the system.
Yeah, that's such a good point because it opens the door for such dangerous practices then, right? Like you make the point in the book that kind of thinking can lead to anti-vaccination rhetoric being appealing and people not vaccinating their children. And then that's just a public health crisis waiting to happen.
Yes, absolutely. And it just makes people, if your only standard for figuring out what's true, or what your primary standard for figuring out what's true is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, you're going to end up invested in all sorts of wacky stuff and not be careful in the way I'm sure you counsel your patients to not be careful about the other things you try. I say to people now after having written this book, diets are a medical intervention. They're a medical intervention. I don't care what kind of diet you're going on. I don't care what you're restricting that has possible side effects. And it's strange to me that just because it doesn't come in a bottle and it's not a pill, that people wouldn't be, given all the evidence about how dangerous dieting can be to your mental and physical health, that people wouldn't think of it like surgery. Do I want to do this? What are the possible side effects? Is it right for me? Am I at a good place in my life mentally and physically to do this? And the reason people don't think of them that way is because they don't look like mainstream medicine. And I think that's a big problem. And I wish people sort of got over that and started to see that just because something's alternative or because something's just a restrictive diet that's been around for a long time doesn't make it any less medical or any less efficacious for good or for ill in your body.
Right. And that if you have side effects from it, look to maybe the diet maybe is causing these side effects instead of, oh, what else can I cut out? Because clearly I'm still sensitive to something and the diet didn't work, so it must be something else.
Yes, exactly. I mean, again, right, so to take this back to religion, there's a very poisonous kind of religious belief in which whenever you are failing or whenever you are unhappy, it is because you are not being holy enough. And so you up the ante, you pray more, you sacrifice more, you self-flagellate more. And that can be an endless cycle where you get worse and worse. But instead of thinking to yourself, hey, maybe I need to go easier on myself. Maybe God really isn't punishing me for being dirty and sinful. You don't think that. You think it must be because I'm bad. And I think the same thing happens with people's mental and physical health. They think, well, I'm just not being hard enough on myself. I need to exercise more. I need to eliminate more. I'm still dirty. I'm still sinful. I'm still impure. And that's a terrible cycle. And it's very, very difficult to break, in part because you become that in the same way that your religion becomes your identity. Your dietary practices and rituals and your beliefs about which foods are clean and unclean become who you are. And so to stop doing that takes enormous spiritual wherewithal, because it requires admitting that the self that you are may need to change.
Yeah. And it can also require taking yourself out of a community that you've been a part of and felt accepted by, right? Like if I've heard clients talk about leaving veganism and how, much pushback they get or their friends disown them and they suddenly don't have any friends or whatever, because there's so much attachment to that value system that if you could possibly go against it, then you're not my friend anymore,
Yeah. I think that's really tough. And it's also, it doesn't have, I think there's an all or nothing to a lot of people's dietary practices that's more like religion. I, for example, so something I did in my personal life, I cut down on the amount of meat I was eating because I was concerned about animal welfare and because I was, somewhat convinced that would be better for the environment. But it's not an all or nothing thing for me. And this is something that a psychologist named Paul Rozin calls the monotonic fallacy. And this is an idea where if a lot of something is bad, then a little bit of it must also be bad. And so you think about this in terms of Orthodox Judaism, right? A little bit of pork is not kosher. It's not like if you just eat a lot of bacon, it's bad, but a little bit isn't. Foods are binary. They are either clean or dirty, pure or impure, blessed or not blessed. And I think that people should look at their dietary practices and think to themselves, is that how I'm approaching food? You can be, I think personally, there's a lot of ways to approach eating healthfully for yourself and for the world that don't need to be end all be alls, that don't make it so that you show up to Thanksgiving and cause this huge family fight because you're not able to sit down and eat grandma's favorite, whatever that you've been eating. And all of a sudden you're never eating Thanksgiving meals with your family and it's ruined your relationship. Food is a really important ritual. And when you take these kind of hardline stances, it can have an incredible impact on your life in a way that a more measured approach doesn't have to.
Yeah, that's such a great point. It's the gray area is not embraced enough in modern people's relationships with food.
No. And I think a part of that is because it's easier to stick to stuff when you have black and white rules. When it seems like it's been handed down, this is just dirty, I will never touch it. I mean, I remember when I was writing the book, my wife and I decided we weren't going to eat gluten or sugar for a week. And I remember vividly when we went into the cafe that we always go to, and all of a sudden we're looking around at these people just munching on their croissants, and we were like, oh, we're not like you. I felt like this ascetic wandering in the desert. It was this amazing, empowering feeling. There was no paradox of choice. I felt different. I felt better. And a part of that, I think, was just having these rules in place that, in the short term, maybe give you a rush, but in the long term can, potentially ruin your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And not having rules makes you have to make decisions constantly, right? And I think that, so my practice and sort of approach with teaching people about nutrition is intuitive eating. So allowing them to really reconnect with their bodies, hunger and fullness cues, make food choices from a place of self-care with a little bit of gentle awareness of nutrition, but also awareness of pleasure and satisfaction, and not demonizing any foods and really just thinking like all foods fit. So what do I want? And it's actually how we were born, knowing how to eat. Like we all have the capacity to do this. We all were born with hunger and fullness cues and desires that sort of pointed us in a direction that was right for our body. But we get away from that through culture and really diet culture, leading us astray and telling us like the answer is outside yourself. You have to follow this one way of eating and you can't have these foods that you love. So like getting back to intuitive eating, it feels, I think, for a lot of people early on, like flying without a net or something, like they're just suddenly really at a loss for what to choose. But then I find that when people go on in it, they stop asking me so much like, but what should I even eat? And sort of experiment and figure it out for themselves. And then it's just like, oh, I just grabbed this for lunch and it was fine. Like it's not a big deal. And it sort of food takes its place as just one aspect of your life, and you can have a lot more attention on other things all of a sudden.
Yeah, no, it's true. And it's something that you don't realize how much. I have this assignment that I do with my students in my introduction to religion class, where I have them design their own spiritual exercise to help them deal with something that's stressing them out in their life. And I can't tell you how many of my students are stressed out by their bodies or by food, and they just want to think about it less. They just want to, there's one, I remember this one spiritual exercise. This student said, her mom was in town and she doesn't get to see her mom very often. And they were walking around the store and all she could think about was whether or not she was going to eat a snack and whether or not it would be bad for her. And she was, regretted essentially not being able to focus on being with her mother because this was taking up all of her mental energy. And one of the responses that you get from people who are really in this diet culture is, well, don't you want to be healthier? Don't you want to live longer? And I always say, well, provided that you subtract the amount of time that you spend thinking about food from your lifespan, maybe. But if you did that, I think you'd find that people who are obsessed with food lose a lot of time. They lose a lot of quality. And one of the things that's so disturbing to me about the misappropriation of religious rhetoric by diet gurus is that they say that they're talking holistically. They always talk about holistic health. but they're never talking about holistic health. They're only talking about physical health. They never say things like, well, it's important to be able to be relaxed and just go to your kid's birthday party and not freak out that there's cupcakes there. Or, it's important to be able to just go to the movies and have some popcorn with salt on it, or whatever it is. Thinking holistically about food means understanding that food isn't just about being medicine. And yet, that's what the vast majority of popular diet books reduce food to. So there's all this rhetoric of holistic health, but they actually cut out the entire sociocultural part of our lives, which is so important.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy. It's not about holistic health at all. It's about, like you said, just physical health and putting your holistic, other aspects of your health at risk because it's creating so much anxiety and drama around food that your mental health suffers, your relationships suffer, your ability to just live your life and get things done suffers. It's like everything narrows.
There's no way to enter how much fun you had into your Fitbit.
Right. Yeah. There's no like pleasure scale.
Yeah. What a sad thing. Can you imagine sitting at the pearly gates and just watching all of the footage of you thinking about these things? Oh my
I
gosh.
know.
It's so sobering, and I realized
Yeah.
again, right? I was doing it myself so much when I was writing the book. It's still kind of stuck with me a little bit. It's terrifying. I can only imagine what it's like to be looking at, these Instagram feeds and these blogs where, people are like doing downward dog while sipping a kale smoothie. It's just like, it's incredible. It's like, it's propaganda really, when you boil it down.
It really is. I mean, that's one of my biggest tips for people is to, change your Instagram feed or change your, all your social media, just like unfollow those people. And if you can't, if they're like friends of yours, then add a bunch of other people who are body positive and doing the opposite of that. People in larger bodies or people in all size bodies eating cheeseburgers and enjoying themselves and having a nice life.
Right. Well, and there's this tremendous fear though. And again, obviously when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I'm a religion professor. So I think about everything in terms of religion, but there's this fear that if you abandon the one true path, you will forever throw away your chances of salvation. Right. So in the diet world, it's like, well, what if she's telling me to unfollow these people, but like, the key to my happiness really is in that blog. And if only I what if I do the whole 30, and that really is the key to salvation, and and of course it isn't. It doesn't work like that. Certainly not in the secular world. There is no key to salvation. There's no miracle. There's no one true path. And it's very hard to break away from that because it's incredibly comforting in some ways to think that's out there. Because then you can just find it and poof.
I know.
Everything will be resolved, but life doesn't work that way.
I know. I think I'm realizing that my spirituality, which I'm also like one of those spiritual but not religious people, and I didn't grow up with religion at all, so I kind of had to find my own way. And I think that Buddhism really influenced how I relate to food and my body. Buddhist practices like mindfulness and yoga were a huge part of my recovery. And so now, thinking about that, I mean, I guess I've always had this sense that life is a great mystery and that's really cool. I remember like looking at the stars with my dad as a kid and him being like, we don't know what's out there. And that's exciting,
Right.
So I've always kind of had that, but I think that that's informed how I teach other people to relate to food. I'm just realizing this now. Like, I think a lot of us in the anti-diet, intuitive eating world are approaching it in this way that like the answer is within you, which is a very Buddhist sort of approach. It's like being here right now, being present, following your intuition. That's what it's about.
Yeah, it's fun. There's a kind of Christian mysticism too, where God is this thing beyond anything we can understand, where God is mystery. And there are some amazing Christian mystics who embrace this idea of God as mystery, but that's not the kind of, the Abrahamic religions in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. It's not the most popular version of the Abrahamic religions, but I think that actually everyone could deal with a dose of worship of mystery, right? Being comfortable with mystery, I think, is really important. And all the great religions of the world have a mystery side to them. They have a play side to them, right? Don't take stuff so seriously, right? Be like little children And I think, though, that people are only sometimes they only see that, or we only see that on the Eastern side. It's easier to find that mystery and playfulness in these Eastern traditions. But I think it's really helpful for everyone to take that kind of attitude and apply it not just to their eating life, but to their spiritual life as well, which are really one and the same, right? You can't separate these things out. Again, right? Bringing us back to Lent and the way in which all these things are kind of intertwined. Really
Yeah.
thinking holistically, you have to ask yourself, do I want the rituals in my life, which include something as pedestrian as eating breakfast to something as obviously religious as going to church? Do I want those to be about hard and fast rules and clarity and rigidity? Or do I want them to also have a space for mystery and for transgression of rules, right? Of subversion, of occasionally crossing lines and not having to be so strict all the time. Jesus was a rule breaker as much as he was a rule follower, and so I think that's really important. And we've been programmed to our detriment with the idea that if you are not following rules rigidly and you are not strict, you are dirty and unholy, because that's never been the consensus in any religion.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the concept of sin is present pretty much everywhere, right? And I forget who it was who explained it this way, but it was some philosopher, I think, who said that the origin of the word sin is like missing the mark. It's not
Yeah.
like, something terrible that's happened. It's you just missed the mark on that one.
Yeah, and that's okay. That's all right. You don't have to beat yourself up about it. And as I'm sure you know, and your listeners and your clients know, beating yourself up about stuff just isn't an effective way to improve yourself. There's no one out there who would say, well, if you're failing, you just need to be harder on yourself. Really criticize it. Really find people who are tougher on you and insult you more and degrade you more. That's what it's going to take.
Right.
It's so ridiculous, and yet we do that to ourselves with diet culture, right? That's always the thought. Well, if this isn't working, it must be because I'm bad and I'm not doing it right, and I need to be harder on myself, which is just totally crazy.
Totally. We talk to ourselves in a way that we would never talk to anyone else.
Yeah, that's something I've ever heard that. Talk to yourself the way you would talk to a friend. It's such good advice. And I think also, I mean, that's I can only imagine with diets, right? Would you tell your friend to have this? Would you wish the attitude that you have towards food onto a friend? And if the answer is no, or would you wish it onto your grandmother or your child? And if the answer is no, it's worth at least pausing and thinking about that. At the same time, right? I want to again step in. There are people with serious problems who need to figure out a solution, and they're going to try stuff. So I don't for a second want to sound like I'm simply hand waving away the very real dietary problems and very real dietary solutions that people have. It's only to say that there are other possibilities. And if something's not working for you, if you're still not satisfied, maybe it's worth considering those possibilities instead of just looking for another diet.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I think understanding and considering people's relationships with food and how they're eating, how they're approaching food, and how they're talking to themselves about food is something that's really missing from a lot of gastrointestinal specialists' repertoire. So if you've gone to a million doctors or, even like naturopaths or people who are putting you on elimination diets or whatever, a lot of those folks don't ever think about relationships with food. I actually did an episode debunking, or not debunking really, but, an episode about how elimination diets can lead people astray, and got a lot of probably the most negative feedback of any episode from a particular subset of dietitians. And one of them wrote to me and she said, I don't even understand how people can have a relationship with food. Food is an inanimate object. How do you have a relationship with food? And it was like this whole area that was just seemed like she was not even willing to consider. So I think there are a lot of people like that out there who are like, let's find the dietary demon and don't hold space for other possibilities like, are you restricting? Are you binging? Are you purging? Are you overexercising? Is that affecting how you feel? Versus, what can we eliminate to make you feel better?
Yeah, and and of course there's going to be people for whom this works. I'm sure there were strict Puritans who really, a couple of people really just felt better not dancing and, not have, they just hated that stuff. It was great. They just got to be straight and narrow, it worked really well. They made tons of money because they were so austere and saved it all and never bought themselves anything nice. But what works for one person isn't going to work for everyone. And you're going to get the extremes with whoever it is that's trumpeting some kind of miracle cure. And so even if there are people out there who just don't have relationships with food, that doesn't mean that your everyday person should take the same approach. So there is diversity of human beings, but one of the things that means is that you need to be very careful before you adopt another human being's relationship, because it might not be the right one for you.
That's a great point. And the dietary gurus out there are often selling something that worked for them, right? Like so many of them are like, I healed myself with this, or I cured my X disease with that. And that might be true for them, but is that going to be valid for the general population?
Right.
I don't know.
And again, right, what you just said, I mean, just hearing those words come out of your mouth brings me back again to religion, right? It just sounds so much like a revival that, I cured my ex. Tell me, I cured this, I healed that. I think that while you can cure things with food, you can do that. This isn't total BS. Be very, very careful when there's a halo on your ice cream and a promise that it is going to save you. It's just that should send up all sorts of red flags and set off all kinds of alarm bells.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think pay attention to those. Like as an aspect of intuition, I think alarm bells are very useful. I think when you have sort of an awareness of this stuff happening, because I talk a lot in the podcast about like sort of once you've seen diet culture for what it is, and once you've seen that disordered eating manifests in all these different ways around you, it's very hard to unsee it. And then you hear people talking diet talk all around you, and it's like, oh my God, this is everywhere, So kind of using that, once you understand how it works, I think you can kind of use that knowledge and that awareness and those alarm bells that go off to kind of keep you from slipping back into it.
Yeah, no, and honestly, I mean, Christy, I tell you personally, because I experienced slipping into this again, right? I was not someone who was a part of this community, and I wrote this book. And one of the things I started doing, it was unbelievable. I would sit down to dinner and I'd look at my plate and I would do this crazy mental calculus where I'd be like, well, I'm having steak and that's bad for me, but I got broccoli. That's good for me. I got wine and that's bad for me, but it's red wine. That's good for me. I mean, it's like, it's just crazy, and I was doing this subconsciously, I'm sitting there doing this. And that was never how I related to food. It's not how I relate to food now. It's not I should sit down and just enjoy the meal and think about what the food tastes like and where it came from and how grateful I am to be eating it wherever I am and just to have it at all, and it's such a handicap in a way to just, imagine if we treated our, although we're being encouraged, I think in certain ways to treat our whole lives like this, right? To quantify everything. Like, was it useful? I need to just walk around my house a little bit today because I haven't walked around my house enough, or like you can't go on a walk just to go on a walk. It's got to be a part of some kind of, quantifiable life equation. And that seems to me, it can be useful, but also a little dangerous. We start to, numbers start to be overlaid onto everything. Like we've got some kind of headset on and we're looking through it and there's little value numbers attached to our foods and to the actions we take in our lives. And that's tremendously unhealthy, I think, and can descend, people I've interviewed, and I'm sure people that you work with can descend into pathology, right? Where you're constantly afraid that equation is not right and you need to keep upping it and the output needs to be better and you're falling short. That's just it's not a good place to be.
It's really not. Yeah. I mean, the whole step tracking and all the apps that quantify every aspect of your life, I think can get so obsessive for people, especially anyone who's already got that tendency. If you're already doing that with food or you have an eating disorder and you sort of start recovering from that, it's easy to slip into that with other things.
It's true. And again, I used to be the kind of person who would just launch into mocking Fitbits or something. But again, I know I've realized now everyone has their own way of approaching things. And things work for other people that don't work for me. And so, and that's, it's not rocket science, but I'm sort of empathetically stunted in that way. So that was a big revelation. But I do think still, it should come with a warning label. A lot of things come with warning labels. You can have them anyway. I drink alcohol and I know it's dangerous and I'm aware of that. And I treat it with the respect that it deserves. The same thing is true of Fitbits and diets. They've got a warning label. Maybe it's the right thing for you. Maybe that Fitbit really is, but read the fine print that says that in some people, it has X, Y, or Z side effects. And as long as you're engaging in these activities with that kind of awareness, then I think you're good to go. But too often we are sold these activities with enormous promises and a total lack of awareness that needs to accompany those promises.
Yeah, and we don't see the side effects for what they are. It's like if we had warning labels on these things and then experienced those side effects, maybe we could say, oh, I'm experiencing the side effect that they told me about, so maybe I should stop doing this.
Right.
But instead, we kind of go into it blind, and then we're like, oh, weird, I'm starting to get these rashes, or I lost my period, or my hair's falling out. I guess I'll just do it more.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, actually, maybe you should just stop the restrictive diet. Maybe that's the thing that they didn't tell you.
And another thing that people do, which drives me crazy, this also has to do with purity stuff, which is imported directly from religion, is people describe a set of symptoms that are actually just a description of being human. So they'll say, you'll read these things where it's like, so do you ever feel sad? Are you ever tired? Well, fear not, like your deficiencies can be done away with. And of course, it's like, who in the world doesn't feel sad sometimes? It's the strategy of pathologizing normalcy and then selling people a cure to something that wasn't really a problem at all. We're all flawed. Life is never perfect. And a much better cure for occasional sadness is realizing that occasional sadness, being sleepy and having a foggy brain every once in a while, that's life. That person next to you, they also get sad sometimes. They also are dissatisfied with their body. I think instead of promising pure bliss, people should not manipulate humans by playing on their desire for something that's impossible, that they can't have, and making you feel inadequate when you don't live up to that impossible ideal.
Yes. Oh, so well said. We're going to have to wrap up. I could talk to you forever, but I think that's a good note to end on. So where can people find you online and learn more about your work?
They can find me online on Twitter, Alan Levinovitz, and I write on a wide variety of topics. Things have been derailed by politics, so I've been writing a little bit about politics these days. But I write for Slate, for Wired, The Atlantic, Eon Magazine, which is a great sort of longer online magazine, bunch of different places, Vox, and so you can find my writing in all of those places.
Awesome.
Yeah. So that's it. I hope people find my book, of course, books on Amazon. So I encourage people to go and check it out and ignore the title.
Yes, I will link to that in the show notes as well. I love your writing, and oh my God, politics is like a whole other can of worms that we could get into. But as you were speaking, there was like so many connections I was thinking of with our current situation. And we have talked a lot about that on the podcast too. So
I'm detoxing right now.
Yeah, that's a good thing to detox from. Got to do it. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's great talking with you.
Thank you for having me, Christy. It's been a pleasure.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to our guests for being here and to you guys for listening. And we'll be back again next week with another brand new episode. Meanwhile, I'd love to stay in touch. And the best way to do that is via email. So you can go to christyharrison.com/email to sign up for my VIP list. I'll send you info about new episodes of the podcast as they drop, as well as exclusive sneak previews of new episodes, giveaways and other special deals on the products and services I offer, special tips on how to make peace with food and learn to trust your body, and a whole lot more. Sign up at christyharrison.com/email. You can also subscribe via iTunes and leave us a nice rating and review, which is a great way to get the word out about the podcast and help other people find these important messages. Just go to iTunes from your computer or your podcasts app, type in Food Psych to the search bar, click on the result that comes up under podcasts, and then click on ratings and reviews, and you can leave a rating and review right there. And I really appreciate all the 5-star reviews and wonderful ratings that we've gotten, because it's helped us climb really high right now in the rankings. And that's really cool because we're competing against some of the weight management and body shaming types of messages that I'm trying to fight with this podcast. So we've really started to beat out a lot of the diety voices, and I'd love to continue climbing higher in the rankings to get this message out even further. So please leave us a nice rating and review. It's so very much appreciated. And thanks to everyone who's left reviews so far. The music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put you there in that perfect position now? Bullies want your food, and you ain't really beat. Have you ever went over your friend's house?